from human health to agriculture. Even within human health itself, we have people who work on diagnostics, therapeutics. Most of the members of this panel gave presentations earlier today or yesterday. So the delegates that are viewing this session have had an opportunity to listen to some of the presentations. And the panel is going to be a freestyle of sorts, where we will engage in a dialogue about the role of biotechnology innovation in addressing the challenges of healthcare access in poor countries or developing countries, as well as food security issues. Some of the opinions or some of the statements may sound controversial to the uninitiated ear, but I'm hoping that through dialogue, we will begin to unpack this diverse and this complex area of biotechnology. And as BioAfrica, our biggest objective for creating BioAfrica as a platform is to really engage with the rest of the global community, to engage with the rest of the innovation community, to see if there is a possibility, which we believe there is, and this is represented by the likes of Dr. Lawrence Banks, for African countries to access these innovations so that they can begin to build a self-sustainable capability in providing medicines, diagnostics, and the like. If anything, COVID has taught us how important innovation is, as well as the ability to manufacture diagnostics, particularly with COVID, inside our own countries and our continent. We had a very bizarre situation where, despite the fact that the diagnostic tests are very profitable for the likes of big multinational diagnostic companies, we ran out of stock. The disruption in international supply chains was a wake-up call. If there's one thing that we didn't predict when we started this journey 3 years ago, was that innovation will assist us in creating sustainability in medical supplies, whether these are diagnostics or vaccines and the like. And we don't believe that COVID is the last of our big pandemics. So if there's a time to start having a conversation, it is now, and to try and mobilize international collaboration with people from across the world who believe in the ideal of universal access to care, as well as universal access to nutritious foods. So with those words, I would like to introduce my panel, and I'm going to move from left to right on my screen. I am not sure whether it's the same in everybody's screen, but I'm going to use a very simple technique, which is left to right, and ask each panelist to introduce themselves and maybe say 2 words or so, synopsis of what they do and what their interest in today's panel discussion is going to be. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Giorgio Roscigno. Dr. Roscigno.
Yes, thank you, Nhlanhla, and thank you, everyone. I mean, I'm so proud and honored to be a member of this quite distinguished panel, and with my very old friend and really much more than that, Dr. Professor Ariel Pablos-Mendez, who is the one who passed me the virus of global health and global public good in the year 2000, when we started working together in creating organization meant to for poverty-related diseases. And we started with TB, which was our main area of interest. I was coming from industry, 20 years in the pharmaceutical industry, where I developed all the fixed dose combination for TB, and the only one non-toxic drug for sleeping sickness approved by the FDA, all of them. So that My interest in all this, well, you know, I am Italian, as Richard was mentioning, but I was born and brought up in Africa, so and particularly in Ethiopia. So for me, my dream has always been that, you know, we have to do something, and particularly in how do we bring back technologies to Africa in a way that, as Nhlanhla was just mentioning now, we can't afford anymore to have another big pandemic as the one we are facing now, and we are having here stuck completely in the middle of all this, and we don't have reagents because we don't have capacity to manufacture them. And even though we could have that capacity because we have brilliant people in Africa and you know, brilliant capacity to do things, but for many reasons we haven't done that, and I think it is really very. And the idea about all this is also how do we develop global public good. And I just want to give you one example that is relative to what my experience and my background is. You know, I was 20 years in the industry, then with Ariel Pablos-Mendez, the year 2000, just 20 years ago, we created Global Alliance in Cape Town. And then that was for new drugs for TB. And after 3 years, I was convinced by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to move into a new exercise, which was which was to develop new diagnostics for poverty-related disease. And again, we started with TB. And that was, for me, you know, at that time, just 20 years ago or 15 years ago, in TB, we only had microscopy, which was a 100 years old technology, which was the only technology available. Even though some molecular diagnostics were used in Europe and in the United States, they were completely non-used in our continent, in Africa. So for me, that was the first thing, was how we could bring molecular diagnostics, which at that time was really something very much more complicated than what we have now, much more expensive than what we have now, and have that available for people in Africa. And that's what we did. And we moved into an agreement with Cepheid, with GeneXpert. We brought the GeneXpert. That was the very first time that the World Health Organization in the year 2010 officially recognized and recommended a molecular diagnostic test to be used in Africa, to be used in public health in Africa. And that was the GeneXpert. And this was such a rewarding achievement, because we demonstrated that it was possible to do that. Where we failed, and that's where we have to come back and really rethink, you know, and with people like all of you, that are so, you know, we have the young, the new scientists and the rising star in Africa like Atherton here that can really push this. And we have the experience of people like Ariel, we have Richard, we have Dr. Banks and Ted and everyone else. We have to really start thinking about how do we move now? What's the next step? What is that we failed from the moment we demonstrated that we can use in the public health the more sophisticated technology? Why is it that we have not been able in Africa now to move the second step, which is to make sure that those technologies are available to the people at community level, which is the most important part of it. But on the other hand, also, why have we not been able to stimulate our intelligence, our people, our African experienced scientists to move into manufacturing, of these new technologies? So this was my my thing, and I'll just pass to you back again, Nhlanhla.
Thank you so much, Giorgio. I'm going to break the rules now. I know he is not going to like me for it because he's much too humble, but I'm going to tell a story that I think I may have told Lawrence. I was in Trieste about 2 years ago when I met the man, Sir Richard Roberts, who is the 1993 Nobel Prize winner for physiology and medicine. I promise you, I felt like a groupie. I was looking for his autograph right there and there. And I went to Lawrence to say, how do I approach him? So I'm going to hand over or pass on the patent to him just to introduce himself. And sorry for doing this, Sir Rich. I know you're too humble to be introduced in that manner, but I couldn't help myself. I apologize. Hope you don't hold it against me.
Okay, well, I'm Rich Roberts. My friends call me Rich, so that's what I hope you all will be. I'm a molecular biologist. I work on bacteria. I actually work on DNA methylation in bacteria. And I have a great love for bacteria because, of course, without them, we cannot live. But one of the things that I have been doing since I won the Nobel Prize is to try to use the fact that I know a lot of Nobel Prize winners, a lot of them trust my decisions on things. And so I've found a great deal of support for various campaigns that I've run for humanitarian purposes of one sort and another. And the current pro-GMO campaign is just one of those. I've done a number of other things along the way, but at the moment, I really feel there is a big problem with the way in which science is portrayed to people, whether they be just the general population or whether they be politicians. And so I use the GMO campaign, among others, to really try to get to politicians and to get some education about science into the politics. And I feel rather strongly that we need to educate kids about science, but also how to communicate science. And as they get older, how to communicate our science to the general public. Because I think in general, this is something we don't do terribly well. And I think it's incredibly important if we're going to be taken seriously that people understand what we're doing. I think COVID is a good example of how there's been a lot of misinformation put out. A lot of politicians have done things for political reasons rather than scientific reasons. And I think GMOs and sustainable agriculture is exactly the same situation. Far too much politics getting involved in what can be a wonderful good for the people.
Thank you for that, Rich. I'm going to move on to Dr. Ted Love from our partner organization, Bio, but he'll speak not about Bio USA, but about GBT and his views on access to healthcare.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So again, my name is Ted Love. I'm a physician and molecular biologist by training, but most of my career has been in the biotechnology industry. It was back in 1992. I left Harvard and joined a little company called Genentech and worked on a lot of drugs, many of which are household names now. And after Genentech, I got involved in starting companies. I actually had retired and only sat on boards and tried to help young CEOs and young companies. But I got a call one day about a venture group that knew me very well that wanted to start a company focused on sickle cell disease. And obviously, being an African-American physician trained in the US, I had seen firsthand how sickle cell disease was really a terrible problem. And quite frankly, there was actually a lot of racism in how the patients were treated. And I actually became a cardiologist, so this wasn't my specialty, but the scientific approach that the company wanted to take to sickle cell disease was very compelling to me. And without going into a lot of the details, hemoglobin is the protein inside of the red cells that carries oxygen. And it is the protein that has the mutation in sickle cell disease. And what the mutation causes is the hemoglobin to come out of solution, like sugar coming out of solution, and organize into rods. And those rods cause the red cells to deform into sickle shapes. So that's really the disease. And the novel idea was to make a small molecule that could be formulated as a pill that could bind to the hemoglobin and prevent it from polymerizing or sticking together anymore. And if you could do that, you could fundamentally reverse the disease. So I came out of retirement actually to do that. And it's been an amazing story. We actually moved very quickly from first human studies in 2015 to actually getting the drug approved in the United States at the end of last year with a very accelerated pathway. And now we are on a path to get the drug approved around the world. And we're actually on a path to make it available in Africa, India, everywhere there's sickle cell disease. And we intend to do it in a way that it is financially feasible for everyone in the world to have access to the drug. We're still early stage, we're still a relatively small company, but there are a lot of partners from the World Health Organization to the World Bank, possibly the Gates Foundation. There are a lot of partners that we expect to collaborate with and make this therapy and other therapies that we make for sickle cell disease available around the world. So it really is a pleasure to be here to talk to you all. I also can tell you that I am one of the leaders at Bio in the US, and I come to you also as a Bio partner and offer any kind of collaboration that we can provide to you as you pursue the biotechnology industry in Africa. I am a big supporter of biotechnology. And as Dr. Roberts just said, science. I grew up extremely poor on a farm in Alabama. And it was really science, medicine, which was able to kind of get me into a different situation in life where I've been able to have a wonderful career, and a career, quite frankly, which is focused on trying to help the world, which is what I think everybody on this panel is focused on. So thank you again.
Thank you for that introduction, Ted. I'd like to invite Lawrence Dr. Banks to introduce himself and give us a brief synopsis of what it does. Lawrence.
Okay, thank you. Again, I'd just like to reiterate as well what a great pleasure it is to be here today amongst such a distinguished panel. So thank you for the invitation. So I'm a virologist by training. My research is focused on human papillomaviruses and cervical cancer. And we're interested in understanding how the virus can cause cancer and also to develop novel ways for therapeutic intervention. Institutionally, I'm the Director General of the ICGEB, which is an international organization. We have 65 member countries located throughout the world, and we have a very strong presence in Africa, where we have 21 member states. Obviously, one of our most important partners is South Africa, where we also have an ICGEB institute located in Cape Town. So the main aim of the organization and the reason that I'm here today is to try and promote the use of biotechnology and getting the fruits of biotechnology to populations within our member countries. And obviously within low resource environments within Africa, this is an absolute priority. And we have several ways in which we're attempting to achieve this. Obviously, we have a very active program of providing fellowships and training in the field with scientists in Africa and attempting to build local capacity, which I think is absolutely fundamental. We're also, we also do produce some of the technologies that are needed. So for instance, insulin, human growth hormone, interferons, we can transfer technologies directly to countries that are interested in small pharma, essentially letting them run with the technology and market it locally. And we've been very successful with that in Asia. We really need to now start getting these transfers working in Africa. And that's something we may wish to discuss a little later. The other thing I'd like to just really stress, and this is something that Rich mentioned earlier, and it's something which is also very close to our hearts at ICGEB, is education about science. I think this is absolutely fundamental, both to lay public, so that they understand what science is about and what the products are that are available. This is true across the board, not just in low resource settings. We still see, despite the COVID crisis, a lot of reluctance to take up vaccines. All of this is things that we really do need to debunk some of the mythologies that are out there. So education about science and what science does is critical for not just lay public, but also obviously politicians. And one of the things I'm very proud about with ICGEB is that we have a really very strong program of outreach to children and ensuring that there's a good understanding and an interest in science, because I think this is also critical for the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. I'm going to move on to Professor Ariel Pablos and acknowledge that Dr. Dungu has joined us, but Ariel, over to you.
Thank you, Msomi. As Giorgio said, back in the year 2000, we were very much interested in bridging the gap of the search in biotechnology around the world and the needs, in particular the needs in Africa, through public-private partnerships, which were addressing what at the time were both market and state failures. We didn't have many drugs for many killers. And AIDS, of course, was bringing a lot of energy. gays was bringing a lot of energy. And that was the cocktail for many of those product development-oriented organizations. I'm proud to say that one of them, which I worked with Giorgio out of Cape Town, was the Global Alliance for TB Drug Development. And FDA approved Predominate last year. And that's going to make a big difference in the most resistant forms of tuberculosis. I would like to make 3 points on capacity, on science, and on markets. I think on capacity, clearly, I mean, Africa has been supporting research capacity around the world, in Africa in particular, and we have seen, again, leadership and capacity. And importantly, in the year 2001 or so, when we were just gearing up to fight AIDS in Africa, one of the key things was research, and research had been paralyzed out of some of the ethical concerns on the European use and so on. And we needed to reignite that. And Tony Fauci joined us in that meeting. And after that meeting, the NIH began to pay for indirect cost in research institutes in Africa. And I thought that was very important, because money is very important if you're going to move forward. And so the capacity, there are many ingredients for that capacity. Part of that capacity links to the market potential as well in Africa, and I will come back to that. But on science, I would have to say bio is, of course, about innovation. Some people say, what is the difference between big pharma and bio? Bio is really more about the cutting edge of innovation, leveraging technology. And I think that the human genome sequencing in the 90s really was the energy that saw the emergence of bio in the United States. I think now with Ebola and with COVID, those are 2 sources of potential energy for BioAfrica to gain visibility and resources going forward. And as we just heard from Sir Richard also, it's not just human medicine, but it's also food, where biotechnology play an important role. And at the Rockefeller, of course, Norman Borlaug, so Nobel Prize, has been quite supportive of GMOs in around the world, but in Africa in particular. In terms of markets, Africa is the future, right? It's clearly is both the origin and the future. But when you look at the population alone, which doubled more than 3 times last century, it will not double in the whole world again, ever. But in Africa, it will. The population of Africa will grow, and that demand needs will translate in markets. One of the great transformations of the international development success of the last 20 years has been also the fact that poverty has been improving, and the economies of countries have been improving compared to where we were in the early 90s with debt and the like. And that potential in Africa means that the needs, the demands, and the markets will be at play. This economic transition of health in Africa is very, very important, and how we play, of course, beyond the innovation, there will be the issues of financing and policies for access to those medications, which are very important, but also specifically domestic resource mobilization. What, Gates and global funds will remain very important in terms of resourcing activity. There will be more and more resources locally, and finding ways to harness those resources will be important, both for the innovation as well as targeting the needs. And linking science and markets is the intellectual property. And I have to say that although we have come at it from the public sector, from the public good side, the IP is the lifeblood of biotechnology, and is in a way, although market exclusivity sometimes is challenged by those who care for access in the public sector, the IP regime is very important to foster innovation, to harness investments. And so the capacity to understand IP in Africa is something that we care a lot. And in the last 20 years, to something called MIR, for the management of intellectual property for health R&D in Africa. Universities need to have more capability in understanding how to manage their own IP, how to deal with others in terms of IP, so that in that intellectual wealth can be captured in Africa, for Africa, in a good way. And I think that is something we have to all continue to build capacity on. Much of the markets, of course, in Africa have been, we looked at this from several of the more basic stuff, but it's really India and China have been really covering. I think you will need not only the innovation side, both in academia and in biotech companies, you will need to have to be in the region, be plugged into what will be really the manufacturing, the supply chain, and so on. The central medical stores that USAID and others help create has broad capacity in those supply chains, but it's really a lot of free supply chains in the private sector. Understanding all of that is again important to guide the potential innovation with a need and a market to keep it going. We still have many needs, and in the field of tuberculosis, we have new drugs that we didn't have 20 years ago. We now have gene expert that can also be repurposed for diagnosis of COVID, but we still have many needs. We don't have, for example, enough PPD testing for tuberculosis. The world is running out of PPD tests. So how do we go about developing new, simple alternatives that can be developed locally and so on? Other important opportunities for Africa will be ideas such as the Global Virome Project, a concept that is based on a PREDICT project of USAID, which would like to position to identify and sequence all of the viruses in mammals in the tropical regions of the world, because that's where most of the mutations arise that then jump onto humans and spark pandemics. And I think that Africa will play an important role in things like the Global Virome Project. So I have to say, great capacity, the potential for science is there. And of course, the markets in Africa and the needs of the poor, the biotechnology can also help address, as we learn through the public-private partnerships.
Thank you, Ariel. That's a good way for me to segue to Dr. Baty Dungu, who's just joined us now. Dr. Dungu, the panel agreed that when you join, you introduce yourself and you give us a few pearls of wisdom from your arsenal, your well-known arsenal. Over to you, Dr. Dungu. You can unmute yourself. Baty, please unmute yourself. Unmute.
I must be tired by now. Thank you very much. And once again, apologies for joining late. I had another meeting to one of the subcommittee of the parliament. I'm Baty Dungu. I'm a veterinarian. I'm the CEO of Undistupled Biological Products, which is the state-owned veterinary vaccine manufacturing organization. It's a company in South Africa. We operate as a company, although we're state-owned. We're fully commercial. We produce more than 50 livestock vaccines. Personally, I'm a vet, and I'm also I have a PhD in vaccinology. Beside working for OBP, I'm the vice president of the scientific commission of the World Animal Health Organization, OIE, some of you may know, which is based in Paris. And I'm also a board member of the International Veterinary Vaccinology Network, which runs from the UK. So in the veterinary vaccinology field for quite a number of years. And I think, I don't know whether there was a guiding question to start with the discussions. One thing that I do most is to try to, because I assume most of the people intervening in the panel are from the human health side. I think one tend not to look much into the animal health side, whether how we can contribute to introducing biotechnology into addressing most of the problem that we face as developing countries. One thing that I've done already, which I'm been fairly proud of, is to see some group that were developing some vaccine technology on the human side. We're going on for years because of the time it takes and the level of safety that is required for developing human vaccines. I told them that the best way to have proof of concept for them is to rather look into animal vaccines because it's much faster. We can do challenge studies in animal fairly quickly, which you never do in human. So the group eventually has moved into developing veterinary vaccines and using the technology that they've come up with to look into working on human vaccines. And I think it's, please Nhlanhla, tell me if I'm off the topic, but am I?
No, you can continue. I just need to introduce our last panelist, but I think just complete your statement.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought that I had to talk, or I thought that all the panelists were already introduced. Maybe I would suggest that you do that, and then I can intervene when I should come in. Okay,
thank you, Baty, for that. Atherton is our last panelist to be introduced. And Atherton, I apologize to making you last. It's not because you're the youngest. It's just that on my screen, you are on my extreme right. That's the reason why you are being introduced as the last panelist. Atherton, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Msomi, and thank you so much for this opportunity to be on this panel. I am already taking a lot of notes and learning a lot. My name is Atherton. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I studied in South Africa and then later on in the UK. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Atherton Diagnostics. We develop lateral flow devices for emerging and dangerous pathogens. So these are your Ebola, COVID, Lassa, dengue, Marburg virus. The idea that we have is we want to simplify the diagnostic process that someone undergoes when they have one of these diseases. And the difference between what we do and what has been done before is in the construction of these lateral flow devices, we use aptamers and not antibodies. The advantages for this is aptamers are single-stranded DNA, so they are much more robust. So you get a lateral flow device that does not need refrigeration during transportation and storage. and it doesn't expire after 2 years. When it comes to lateral flow device manufacturing, the largest costs are your labor and your antibodies, typically. So if you use aptamers, it's a much more affordable way of manufacturing them because aptamers cost a 12th what antibodies cost. Lastly, the use of aptamers allows us to develop lateral flow devices at a fraction of the time that it normally takes. I'll explain a bit more. If we look at the case for of COVID, what has happened since the start of the pandemic? In about December, we knew we needed an antigen lateral flow device for COVID. And we don't have one yet. The reason is because it's quite an iterative process to make a lateral flow device. And there's a lot of factors you need to consider. So we're developing a platform that we think of as Legos, in that we make the base Lego at Hutano, which is disease agnostic. So imagine this is the base Lego. And then the Lego block, if it's for Ebola, this becomes an Ebola test. If it's for COVID, it becomes a COVID test. So the Lego block then comes in and you snap it in place and then you've got a diagnostic. So the idea is to reduce the amount of time that it takes to make a lateral flow device. The importance of that, I'll give an example, is, for example, in response to what's happened with COVID, you can make a lateral flow device quickly. If it is an example of what was happening in the DRC 2 months ago, when we had not just COVID, but Ebola, a measles outbreak. So you've got a lot of diseases that are happening. Can you quickly make a multiplex lateral flow device that can quickly identify what the disease is? So that's where our intellectual property resides, and that's where we are going as a company. But the use cases of our diagnostics, so we are a UK-based company that was founded last year in April 2019. And after that, we secured funding and we developed an Ebola prototype. So we've got a prototype Ebola lateral flow device. And for the work that we're doing on the Ebola lateral flow device, we were awarded the GE Waterman Diagnostics Competition for Europe for 2019. And that's been really helpful because we've been getting support from GE Healthcare Life Sciences, now Cytiva, to develop our products. The product that we're also working on is a COVID lateral flow device. Again, we want someone to be able to add saliva to this diagnostic, and then you can, by visual confirmation after 10 minutes, you can tell if you have COVID or not. The difference is not just the use of these aptamers, but we're able to then, because of the low cost of aptamers and their great binding affinity, you can pick up both the S protein and the N protein, S1 and the N protein on the same lateral flow device. So you're looking at multiple sandwiches on the same lateral flow device. We are going to produce this tech, and then the next step is to multiplex so that you can look at a particular geographical region on the African continent and identify what are the diseases that present with similar symptoms at this particular region and what multiplex is required. And lastly, the product I'm really excited about is most recently we were awarded a grant, and starting in 2021, we will be working with the University of Oxford, the Dance School of Pathology, as well as to develop a lateral flow device for veterinary applications using our platform. So to do what we do, so I'm the CEO of the company. Our principal scientist is Dr. Charlotte Maserumule, who is from South Africa. She completed a PhD at Cambridge. She's a named inventor on 2 patents and a phenomenal scientist. Our science is led by Professor William James here at the University of Oxford, and Dr. Paul Abrahams, who is a Zimbabwean and South African, helps us to think through the commercialization of the company. Dr. Glenn Layton, our chairman, is an ex-banker with 23 years of experience. The reason why I do what I do is was partly touched on by what Dr. Ariel was talking about, in that when I was young, the effects of not having access to medicine significantly changed my life. I lost my parents to AIDS. So that gets one thinking that we have the necessary technology that we need to be able to significantly improve the quality of life. What does it take for us to be able to use that technology? And that brings me then to the question around what are some of the challenges that we start to see when it comes to commercializing technology for Africa, which is a point that was touched on by not just Giorgio, but Ariel as well. And I think one of the most pressing challenges for a startup, if it is not an institution, but for a startup or young company, is the question, who are your customers? Who's going to pay for it? And that's a question that comes up again and again. And I'm sure a lot of us have met that question again. And I've started to look at it as a question around customer acquisition cost for the different customers that will buy the different products, or how the commercialization looks like. And I think the challenge is the need is apparent. We will not argue for the need for whatever it is that we are working on, be it a diagnostic, therapeutic, or food. The challenge to do it is present. It is the clarity to revenue that creates a significant problem. And I think that's one of the challenges that are there. I've got a lot of other challenges that are coming to mind, but for this time I'll stop.
Thank you, Atherton. Thank you, Atherton, for that short introduction. What we're going to do now, I'm going to be asking questions in clusters. I was going to start with diagnostics, but Atherton has taken up your time, Giorgio. So we're gonna have to compress your time a little bit. But I'm intrigued by the discussion that Dr. Dungu started around pivoting the vaccine, animal vaccines, to try and bridge the gap in supplies for human vaccines. And I read an article about 2 months ago where you were arguing that with the possibility of new vaccines for COVID and the strong possibility that there will be licensing arrangements for countries that can manufacture for themselves, and that our best hope would be to look at pivoting our animal vaccine production capabilities. I just want to test that idea. Maybe you could, in 2-3 minutes, give us a sense of what the thrust of the idea was. Dr. Dungu.
Thank you very much. I think it's the whole thinking has been part of experience that I've been involved with on a number of occasions. To come back to the one that I brought up, it was a group that was working on plant-expressed antigens. I mean, they were trying to express some human antigens into plants. And I was brought in to review that project as part of a panel of the funders. And I think over the past year or more time, the group was just spending time trying to purify this antigen. Because for human vaccines, you want as pure antigen as possible. You can imagine when you express in plants, it's not so easy to come up with a pure antigen. And my suggestion to them was that, well, an animal vaccine, you won't need that level of purification, and you can get your proof of concept and move forward, which they tried and were successful, be able to progress with that. And I've also worked, before coming back to OBP, I've been in the UK, and I've worked a lot with a group at the Oxford University that is coming up with the ChAdOx adeno expression for the COVID vaccine. They've been working on that vector system for other vaccines like the Rift Valley fever. They've used the same backbone. They've used it also for MERS. And I think a lot of data that have been generated to reinforce the belief in that backbone is what they've done on the animal side. With a zoonotic disease like Rift Valley fever, I think that vaccine has been a good, there's been a lot of data generated and how to consolidate the robustness of the backbone. It's been based on information generated from livestock use of the backbone. And I think even now for the COVID, the work being done in pigs at Pirbright has also consolidated a lot that information. And bringing that then to the South African context, I think it's basically the same approach where, honestly put, I mean, we has more than 100 years of vaccine development experience, obviously different type of technologies, but basic technology like your inactivated vaccine, which is the main technology used currently for most of the animal corona vaccine. As you probably know, we have coronavirus vaccines for cattle, for poultry, and for pigs, and all are based on the inactivated technology, which would apply to any form of corona. So, and those kind of experience are there. So the animal health vaccinology is usually underestimated because we have more flexibility in generating knowledge that can then be used and expanded into vaccines. That's the thinking, and we did put a paper together with some colleagues from the human side who are working on that.
Thank you for that, Dr. Dungu. I'm going to turn to Sir Rich, and this is especially for a lot of the participants who could not attend this morning's plenary. The plenary was very exciting, but what excited me the most was the articulation of how, and I think Dr. Banks has spoken a bit about it in terms of science, communication, and education, how the geopolitics of the global north have contributed to a situation where the global south has been blocked off a path to development via GMOs. I just want to touch on that, as controversial as it may seem, but there were certain truths that were mentioned in that plenary presentation, and that I would like you to share with this panel and a lot of our participants that were not able to attend the morning plenary.
Right. Well, I think what actually happened is that in Europe, Greenpeace and their anti-GMO allies found that this was a very powerful message to enable them to raise funds. This is the best fundraising effort being against GMOs that ever went. And the reason that it went so well, I think, is because they were able to paint very easily really terrible stories about what might happen. They call them Frankenfoods. So you immediately get the idea of Frankenstein. One of the things we know is Hollywood is really good at scaring people. And we go to see these horror movies, particularly to be scared. And the anti-GMO people latched onto that. But then they realized that they cannot pretend that these things are just dangerous for Europe, but they're okay for the developing world. And so then their missionaries go out and try to spread the story elsewhere. And this worked very well, especially among the trade ministers in many countries, because the trade ministers know that a lot of the exports from their countries go to Europe. If Europe is anti-GMO and they are growing GMO plants in their own countries in Africa, say, then they can't export them to Europe, even though it depends why they're exporting them. In fact, Europe brings in more GMO plants than almost anywhere, but to feed the cows and to feed the sheep, feed animals. And apparently GMOs are perfectly safe for animals. They're just dangerous for people. And so we end up in this situation where science is just being distorted in order for political and monetary advantage. And I think it would be good for Africa, South America, Asia, to say, well, screw Europe. We don't want to be taken over by Europe. We've had a taste of that already during colonization. We don't want it to happen again. And when you're looking for trade, instead of looking for trade with Europe, look for trade elsewhere, because there are plenty of places that countries can trade with, including within Africa. So that was really one of the points that I think is really something that's not well understood, how a political movement, a financial movement in Europe spread into the developing countries with disastrous consequences.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to segue to Dr. Banks because he mentioned, is Dr. Banks still with us? He mentioned the importance of education, particularly to the general society. I look back to why AfricaBio as an organization was formed in the year 2000. One of our objectives was to try and educate society to engage with biotechnology in as transparent a manner as possible. We obviously are a pro-biotech organization, but we also have to be sensitive to the anti-GMO lobbies, which, as Sir Richard has pointed out, may have been based on erroneous deductions. And I just wanted Dr. Banks to share with us the ICGEB's experience in trying to fulfill its mission of making biotechnology innovation accessible to the developing world.
Thank you, Nhlanhla. I'd just like to follow on briefly before answering that on something that Rich was saying, because it was very interesting last year when I was at AfricaBio. One of the questions I got asked was, what can Africa learn from the experience of GMOs and GMO regulations in Europe? And my answer to that question was absolutely nothing. They should just ignore Europe. Right. Africa should go its own way and make its own regulations. And so I think I agree completely with what's just been said, but I think it's very important to emphasize that point, that Africa really needs not to look at what's being done elsewhere, but do what works for Africa. From a point of view of ICGEB's commitment along that line, we are very open to the idea of working with countries to really help them develop GMOs within a proper legal framework and within a way that will function in Africa. And that we have had quite a lot of success with in a number of African countries through a project that was funded through Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for several years to help countries in Africa really build up their own local framework for getting GMOs into the market. From a point of view of education and reaching out to populations, ICGEB has a really wonderful track record, I believe, in science communication. And this is something that I believe was talked about this afternoon at the AfricaBio, a program called Science in the City, where we get together leading experts in a public auditorium with national press coverage, where individuals discuss the latest developments in science and biotechnology, and specifically addressing areas where there is contention, where there's a lot of concern in the press about safety, where there's a mythology about a particular technology or a particular product. Those are the sort of things we like to try and focus on and really try and reset the balance such that people realize that science isn't about Frankenstein. It's about trying to get products to populations cheaply and effectively and obviously safely. So that's been that's one of the approaches we've taken. And then the other one is the more direct one of actual technology transfer, where products are transferred directly to countries. They go to most often a small biotech. We provide them with all the expertise to produce those products. and then they can go ahead and market locally. And we essentially step back at that point. It's free for those companies to make profit and charge a price which is competitive locally, but obviously undercuts the big multinationals quite significantly. And so it really has the potential to get to people in the countries that need it. And that is a model that we are really keen to continue with and to expand into other product areas. But I think it's proven to be extremely effective.
Thank you for that, Lawrence. Before I move on to Dr. Love, you've just reminded me, again, it's for the benefit of the other participants, that this afternoon we launched a joint program with the ICGEB. When I say we as AfricaBio, BioAfrica, on the science and the city. And I see one of the chat rooms, one question was about how to make scientific information much more trendy and accessible to the general public. And that's effectively what the Science and the City will aim to do. And this is a very exciting partnership for us as BioAfrica to extend the knowledge of science to communities everywhere within the continent, starting in South Africa. And over time, as we unveiled yesterday, we will try to also to translate the science into indigenous languages, so that not only do you give it to the people in a language they understand in the main, which is English, but also in their own indigenous languages with their own idiom. In that way, we go a long way towards countering some of the misinformation that comes out of lobby groups that have other interests. And with that, I'd like to maybe pass on to Dr. Love, and particularly with regards to what Dr. Banks has raised around the transfer of IP to developing countries, to small companies. So today there was a Bio-USA session that showed a slide on the participation of small companies in response to COVID. And what it showed was an overwhelming majority of the companies that had responded to the COVID pandemic were small companies with what are defined or classified as small companies. And do you think that is a possible avenue for a continent like ours where biotechnology is in its early stages of development, it's in its nascent stages of development, that we could use a combination of what Dr. Banks has spoken about and what Dr. Roscigno and Ariel Pablo spoke about earlier on, to empower small, medium-sized companies and to get them to have access to competitive technologies that will start to address challenges. And I'm asking you particularly because I realize that you work in an area of neglected diseases where the market is not large enough to attract big pharma, and therefore somebody else has to pick up that challenge. If you could just maybe try and combine my jumbled question, Dr. Love.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent idea, and it's actually been a way that HIV therapies have been made available around the world. I know Gilead made its technology of manufacturing available typically to Indian generic manufacturers, and then those manufacturers were able to make the therapies available in countries around the world at a price much lower, quite frankly, than Gilead could have ever done. So that is really a tried and true strategy. And I would personally love for there to be the opportunity to partner with a manufacturing company in Africa to make our technology for sickle cell available, and have that company make the therapy available around Africa. That's one of the ideas that we've been pursuing, and I'm very much looking forward to someone being able to have that kind of alliance with us.
Thank you for that response. I'm going to turn back to Dr. Giorgio Roscigno before he takes out my number from his phone. Giorgio, you've worked in the area of global PDPs and creating innovations to address massive healthcare challenges, but that are not commercially attractive, particularly with the Gene Expert project, which was a revolutionary project at the time it was launched about 10 years ago, if I recall, 2011. It's almost 10 years later, we've not seen anything approximating such impact, even though the challenges continue to mount. We just want to get a sense of where you think the problems or the challenges are, and what do we do as a community of biotech innovators to unblock the system, to allow the system to address, to use innovation to address challenges that affect humanity, regardless of their social status.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very exciting question, and I think it's very good timing. Well, you know, I believe something that what we have done with the Gene Expert at that time was we brought molecular diagnostics in public health in Africa when it has never been before. And in fact, only just after that, the viral load from Russian big companies came in. And it was, and the whole thing is about thinking about public health in Africa, and then thinking about how is it organized. We have technologies like the Gene Expert that address issues at central level. So you have high throughput laboratories where you need big machines, and that was where we stopped. Now, even with the COVID and the public health problems we still are facing in Africa, we do realize that in fact, what we need is to decentralize technologies and really bring technologies as near as possible at community level. And this is very interesting also for animal and veterinary use, you know, because I remember that's exactly the same thing. What you need is that you cannot have projects or programs that are based only on where the diagnostics for public health is all in one central laboratory, and then it's centralized. So what happened with the Gene Expert and the missing, and that's why I'm so excited when I hear Atherton talking about, you know, picking up where the Gene Expert brought molecular diagnostics in the public health at central laboratories, and then coming in with ideas that can somehow bring this as a lateral flow technology and providing some sort of input and answer to the fact that this could now be decentralized somewhere else. We lost that one, Nhlanhla, and that is a very bad thing. And that's where I was asking, you know, a panel like this, you know, and people like all of us that has an interest that both the public health, but also the science and the new generation of African scientists, you know, what can we do to make sure that the Atherton of Africa can pick up what Ted was saying, you know, the technology transfer and the capacity to really bring changes into Africa. Because, you know, I like all these things. We have been creating capacity for all our life, more than 100 years. You know, you look at TDR, WHO, everyone has been creating capacity. But when we look at Africa now, what that capacity created, we don't have in the whole of Africa, in the whole continent, one single manufacturer of raw material for pharmaceutical products. Can you imagine that? So even now, today, when chloroquine seems to be the real breakthrough for COVID-19, whatever, we still are importing the raw material for that. from other countries, and we were not capable of doing it in the continent. So we really have to go back into the real thinking about this and thinking about where the value chain is, where the R&D works on, and really linking more the small scale manufacturing, the middle scale manufacturing, the technology transfer with local scientists and local companies, and giving them the opportunity to grow into the market, giving them the support to be more, let's say, productive. We missed big opportunities in diagnostics with molecular diagnostic. Look at it now. We don't have, the only thing we have is, even now with COVID-19, we have still to collect samples in a very invasive methodology, send it to a central lab to do molecular diagnostic. This because we have not invested in technologies to make molecular diagnostic at point of care level, to provide that sensitivity and specificity so that it is in the hands of the community healthcare workers. We have to democratize public health. We have to decentralize capacity to take decision and to understand where the disease happens, and particularly now with COVID, where the surveillance is going to be the real key issue. We want to know at each community level where are the cases happening, and that we cannot do with molecular diagnostic at the central lab. We need the Atherton, we need the African scientists, we need the overall world to develop molecular diagnostics that are point of care, that empower community healthcare workers to provide the service that they are there to really provide. So I think that, you know, this panel was very, very interesting because everyone has the same heart and the same willing to make the big changes. We really have to think that how do we translate this in real things in real life, and really what really matters is how do we empower the local capacity, the local scientists to move into manufacturing, and how we support them to bring innovation in that manufacturing, and how we can support them to gain the market for those things. Look at the Global Fund. They are spending billions and billions of dollars in drugs that are for TB, for malaria, and for HIV. You know that out of those billions of dollars that the Global Fund is spending, almost not even $1 comes to any African manufacturer. Yet the majority of those products, they all are bought by American companies, European companies, and brought into Africa. And the same thing is for the diagnostic. So this should be our starting point. We should really be aware of this and understand that the opportunities are there, the potential market is there. We have to believe in it. We have to believe in our scientists, in the young people, and we have to empower them. But we have to really also thinking that we have to democratize public health system. We have to empower community healthcare workers. We have to decentralize. We cannot get any gain by having a very powerful central system. Thank you.
Thank you, Giorgio, for those insightful comments. We are 20 minutes away from the end of the session. So what I'm going to ask is to use a queuing system. I'd like to maybe get Ariel Pablos to respond to Giorgio. After that, I would request Sir Richard Roberts, his last words, followed by Dr. Banks, Ted, and finally, Atherton. Thank you. Ariel, if you could maybe respond to Giorgio.
You're on mute, Ariel.
Ariel, you're on mute. Mute. How do you unmute him?
You're mute, Ariel.
Are we on now? Thank you. Somehow the thing didn't go. But I said, don't blame Giorgio's Latin genes. His passion is really more real, more committed to the poor and to the needs in Africa. We heard many ideas, and of course, we've been trying different approaches. And we heard Dr. Love mention, of course, the possibility of global companies helping other manufacturers to address the needs of local. I think it's very important to think in the following way, that first, African innovators need to think of markets beyond Africa, so that their investments and their plans can then be commensurate to that opportunity. They should not be restricted only to thinking of the local, so for the actual innovation. I mean, there are many other needs Giorgio addressed, but for the actual innovation, you have to think of the possibility that your breakthroughs can help the rest of the world and the rest of the markets. You need to imagine that there will be market segmentations for which you can address certain things in a market-driven way, but also then figure out, as you succeed in one, how to address the other. If it's part of your mission from the beginning, that would be ideal. In the end, that's very important. Local manufacturing is important because it's a feedback loop to innovation and to capacity, and there's innovation in manufacturing itself. So all of those things are real, and the question is, why don't they happen? How do we make them happen? Clearly, something like bio is a very important voice, a focal point for activities and thinking, which can help transform. But every country will have their own needs, and it's tricky, and relationships, I would say, too. But there are policies that matter. I mean, I think when the World Bank was willing to pay for differential pricing for local manufacturing in order to foster that local manufacturing, that's a very important thing. We need to make sure that those who buy are willing to pay a higher premium for a local manufacturing that has less of the scale of the local global competitors. So that sort of ideas need to be important. I will also say, Msomi, when BioAfrica and the Global Bio in the United States with Dr. Love, that it will be good to bring more of that capacity development partnership on the one hand. Second, tech transfers, yes, but importantly also the possibility of that capacity when it comes to the management of intellectual property, maybe a patent pool for BioAfrica that can be created by willing partners in the North to share, so that it's easily accessible, things that are common, that it doesn't become a hurdle or later on a lawyering problem. So a simple patent pool for certain areas will be very, very important. And tech transfer capability on both sides will be very important. Relationships will be important. All of those are possibilities to help the innovation part of the enterprise.
Thank you, Ariel, for that. And I'm going to quickly jump to Dr. Baty Dungu for a response, particularly because he spoke about pivoting some of the vaccine capabilities to address our shortages. That patent pool and access to intellectual property could come in handy for such an initiative. Dr. Dungu?
Yes, thank you. I think there's been a number of very interesting concepts that have come up. It's interesting to hear the discussion around the anti-GMO, which is also similar to the anti-vaccine, which has become even stronger. The COVID situation, it's exactly the same situation. The anti-COVID has been anchored based on some bad experience with some vaccine that occurred in Africa. But it's quite encouraging to see that the same approaches are being advised to address this problem. So coming back to how to harness the capacity that we have to see how we can exploit the intellectual property that could be there and bring it into a small company in Africa. I think there's a role that the state-owned industry can play in supporting small entrepreneurs that are trying to venture into the bio sector. I think there's been a number of initiatives of creating some state-owned platform that could assist small entrepreneurs who want to venture into specific technologies where they can cut their costs by using some shared facility. I know in the diagnostic or the vaccine field, there's been a lot of discussion around clinical facilities that can be state-owned, that could be used by different small players to generate the data that they require for, or even for registration data and regulatory, and then therefore cutting costs into venturing into this. So I think there's a big role that the government can play by providing those specific support instead of just dishing out money, which becomes sometimes difficult to utilize to cover all the different aspects. And on top of that, the PPP, the public-private partnerships could also facilitate in that. But I think the legislative part is critical, but I think it should go to the point where government provide tangible support by putting in place shared facility that could make it easier for small players who come into the field. And that's the way we could develop more small players.
Thank you, Dr. Dungu. I'm going to pass the mic on to Sir Richard Roberts for his last observations and comments.
Okay, so one or two things. There's been some talk about government regulations and how they inhibit GMOs. I think government regulations in the developing countries as well as in developed countries often prevent innovation. And I think we need to take a really serious look at how we regulate novelty. And I would always use the example of cell phones. You know, the blue light that emits from cell phones causes macular degeneration. We're now finding kids that have macular degeneration, young people, because of the blue light from their cell phones. That apparently is perfectly okay. It's not regulated, no one's going after it. And yet GMOs, which look to be perfectly safe and can help people, are being regulated. So I think we have to really take a new look at how we should be regulating things. I'm also concerned a little bit about intellectual property, because while I think intellectual property does have a place in some cases, in many places it again prevents innovation and is not helpful. And especially in developing countries, I think one needs to find ways where people from outside of the country are limited in the intellectual property they can have. And this focus on money always drives me crazy. The idea that you should go into business to make as much money as possible instead of going in to help people is also, I think, very unhealthy. And I think we often need to rethink our values. What is it that we really value? Do we value humans for the contributions they can make? I always value Africans, especially because if you want to find people who are best at everything, you go to Africa, because the genetic diversity is such that when you get out onto the fringes of the bell curve, you find people who are really good at doing stuff. And the bell curve is wider in Africa than anywhere else. And so I think there's been far too much exploitation of Africa in the past. We need to do something to make sure that that stops and to help out and take advantage of the creativity that can come from Africa.
Thank you, Sir Rich, for that. And I'm going to pass the mic on to my last two. I'm choosing them because they're partners of BioAfrica, not because I like them too much. I'd like to ask Dr. Banks to respond particularly to Sir Rich's last point around intellectual property, because the mission of the ICGEB is to try and make that intellectual property accessible to developing countries, number one. But number two, to make a point that says that having seen the Technology Development Center in Trieste, it always reminds me that biotechnology in its current generation is about 50 years old. So you've had 2 or 3 patent cliffs, which means that these technologies and products ought to be available to the developing world. And I just want a comment on that before I move on to Ted.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely correct. And I agree with both you and Rich. Those technologies are available. And this is something that ICGEB is really capitalizing on. It's taking products which have passed that patent cliff, they're off patent. We transfer technologies to small companies on, for instance, biosimilars for production within that country. And it's a very successful model. And what I think, what I've heard in this last sort of half an hour or so is how to build up manufacturing capacity, how you can get production within Africa. These off-patent products are absolutely perfect ways of doing it, because many of them do not need huge plants. Productions can be done in relatively small scale, and products that are produced meet all the pharmacopoeia standards that are required from FDA or Europe. So the quality is absolutely assured. And really what is required, and where we're looking for partners, is with outfits with a small production facility. That is all required. So this gets round your IP issue. It allows local producers to be manufacturing. And of course, they will ultimately go on and make a profit and hopefully then be able to expand what they can do themselves. I'd like to add one other point. This has come up several times. It's innovation. Africa has fantastic scientists, but to innovate and to do really new stuff, it needs to be multidisciplinary, and a lot of it requires a good, solid investment in basic science. And I realize that where resources are tight, governments want to see immediate returns. They want to see products that come from the research. But I think you also have to invest in a good, strong scientific base, which will give you real, true innovation. So that's my closing remarks. Thank you.
And thank you, Lawrence. I think I'm going to pass the baton on to Ted as another one of our partners at BioAfrica or at AfricaBio, particularly picking on the point or the suggestion that was made by Ariel Pablos, that perhaps a joint venture in the future should look at the possibility or the concept of knowledge pools or intellectual property pools that can then be made available or accessible to small biotech companies. Even in the US and even and mostly in Africa and other developing countries, that would be very, very useful, considering the fact that there are excellent technologies that never make it to the market for one or the other reason, not because of any failure to do with product utility. Just your last point on that.
Yeah, I mean, there have been so many good points made by the panelists, and I'll just try to emphasize a couple. I do think manufacturing, as Dr. Banks said, is a great opportunity. Small molecules are obviously much easier to make than biologics. And one of the things that I've personally been trying to fight against is inappropriate extension of patent protection. I really do think patent protection facilitates innovation, but there's also abuse of patent protection. And I think people in my position ought to be clear about fighting against that. And I agree with Richard. Some of it's just greed, trying to make too much money at the expense of really trying to do the right thing for our world society. I also would just mention another idea that I was thinking about. I've done a variety of relationships over my career with various countries. And one of the things that I do a lot of today is I contract chemistry from China, particularly. And that's something I think Africa could do. If you've got brilliant chemists, it's a fairly low risk business to actually have an alliance with someone like us, where we would pay you, we would tell you what we want you to make. And what we'd really be buying is cheaper labor, honestly. Because I think all of this really boils down to, you've got to use your advantage. So if the advantage is a lower cost of labor and you have the skill to do something, there is untapped value there. And I think Ariel's point, I'm going to make one other point. I think Ariel's point about not just limiting yourself to African markets is absolutely brilliant. The Indian generic manufacturers make drugs for the whole world, not just India. And that's one of the reasons they've been so successful. So I would just go back and say, I think it's really going to boil down to Africa using its core advantages and bringing those core advantages to partnerships, and or using those core advantages to build your own businesses. And there are examples of that from China, India, that I think we should follow. And I'm personally very interested in trying to help facilitate.
Thank you for that. And the last word then goes to Africa's rising star, our future, Atherton. If you could close the session for us.
Yeah, you're too kind. Thank you. The thoughts that I've been having as we've been speaking about are around the market question. How does the market work? Which is something that Dr. Love and Dr. Ariel spoke to. And I started thinking about, how does a conversation around AfricaBio, the Africa Free Trade Agreement, and Africa CDC look like in terms of making it more accessible for small companies, manufacturers that Dr. Banks, Dr. Love are speaking about, to have that greater clarity on how to build that PPP. And then once that clarity is there, as Dr. Roscigno was saying, you can then start to see capital coming into the work that is being done. And then the education of angel investors, potential angel investors on the African continent who see the problem, who have the resources to come into play. And then government comes in with support for perhaps are these tax breaks for people who invest in these young companies that we are speaking about, as well as looking at getting established companies to increase access to their bio executives. Because when you're building something from as a small company, you need the advice that you get. And as that whole book continues to grow, the next question then becomes, how do we then help these young entrepreneurs through the difficult phases? Because you've got the tech risk, and what we're seeing is this conversation is around dropping the tech risk, so which is fantastic. Now let's see how we can drop the market risk and make it better. Those are my thoughts, but it's been really exciting to continue to learn from this panel.
Okay, I think that brings us to a close, and I would like to thank the panelists, each and every one of you. We are so grateful for your willingness to participate in this panel and to be a part of a movement that we hope in future will be counted as one of our pivotal moments in bringing agriculture and medical biotechnology in Africa to a point where it can be counted on to contribute to society. And as a last word, I would also like to abuse my privilege and request that you make yourselves available from time to time to provide some mentorship and advice to what we're trying to create in BioAfrica. I know that I can count on Dr. Love because we have a partnership with this organization as well as Dr. Banks, but I'm also appealing to all of the panelists, the other panelists, if they could reach out and hold our hands and provide support, especially to some of our rising stars like Atherton. For every Atherton, we hope that you could help us make 10 of them. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.